Let's take a look at Roman slaves' lives under Caesar. Chapter 1. The Chains of Fate. In ancient Rome, the life of a slave was a gamble with fate, where freedom was a distant dream and chains were a harsh reality. Slaves could be anyone captured in war, debtors, or even abandoned children. The Roman economy heavily relied on the labor of slaves, making them an integral part of society. They were considered property and had no legal personhood. Roman slaves could be bought, sold, or rented out like livestock. Slaves were branded or tattooed to indicate their status and ownership. Some slaves served in households, while others worked in harsh conditions in mines or on farms. Skilled slaves, like artisans or teachers, had slightly better living conditions but were still under strict control. Slaves were often punished severely for disobedience or perceived laziness. Whippings, beatings, and even crucifixion were common punishments. Some slaves were forced to wear iron collars as a sign of their bondage. Slave revolts, like the one led by Spartacus, were brutally suppressed. Despite their harsh treatment, some slaves formed close bonds with their masters. These bonds were complex, often involving a mix of loyalty and fear. Freed slaves, known as freedmen, could sometimes achieve significant success in Roman society. However, the path to manumission was difficult and rare. Manumission ceremonies were symbolic, involving the striking of a rod. Freed slaves were not entirely free, as they owed patronage to their former masters. The children of freed slaves, however, were considered free citizens. Slaves were often used as political tools by their masters. They could be bribed or coerced to spy on or betray their master's rivals. The Roman legal system provided minimal protection for slaves. A master's power over his slaves was nearly absolute. Slaves could testify in court, but their testimony was only valid under torture. The lives of slaves were often short and brutal. High mortality rates were common due to harsh working conditions and mistreatment. Despite this, slaves were sometimes able to influence their masters subtly. The relationships between slaves and masters could be complex and multifaceted. Some slaves used their wits to improve their situation or gain favor. The legacy of Roman slavery still impacts our understanding of ancient history and human rights. Chapter 2. A Day in the Life. Imagine waking up before dawn, knowing your day will be filled with backbreaking labor and harsh treatment. For many Roman slaves, this was a daily reality. Household slaves had to clean, cook, and serve their masters without rest. Farm slaves toiled in fields, enduring the scorching sun and cold nights. Mine slaves faced the most brutal conditions, working in dangerous and dark environments. Some slaves served in public baths, keeping them clean and running smoothly. Gladiators, often slaves, trained rigorously and faced death in the arena. Slaves had no personal possessions. Everything belonged to their masters. Meals were basic and insufficient, just enough to keep them working. Any disobedience or mistake could lead to severe punishment. The constant threat of violence loomed over their lives. Despite this, some slaves managed to find small moments of joy and camaraderie. Music, dance, and storytelling were ways to cope with their harsh existence. Slaves formed tight-knit communities, supporting each other in their struggles. Religious practices and rituals provided solace and hope. Some slaves dreamed of freedom and plotted ways to escape. However, escape was risky and often led to death or severe punishment. The journey to freedom was fraught with danger and uncertainty. Roman authorities were vigilant in capturing runaway slaves. Recaptured slaves faced brutal consequences, often as a deterrent to others. Despite these dangers, some slaves successfully escaped and lived as fugitives. Stories of successful escapes inspired hope among the enslaved. Even within their constraints, some slaves demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They used their skills and intelligence to navigate their difficult lives. Some slaves became indispensable to their masters, gaining a degree of influence. The trust and reliance of their masters, however, could be a double-edged sword. The fear of betrayal or being discarded was ever present. The psychological toll of slavery was immense, affecting both body and mind. Slaves had to find ways to maintain their sense of self-worth and dignity. Their endurance and strength in the face of unimaginable adversity are a testament to the human spirit. Chapter 3. The master's whim. The whims of a master could dictate every aspect of a slave's life. A good mood might result in leniency, while a bad one could bring harsh punishment. Slaves had to anticipate and adapt to their master's moods and desires. Some masters were known for their cruelty and sadism. Tales of extreme punishments and tortures were not uncommon. Sexual exploitation of slaves was widespread and often brutal. Female slaves were particularly vulnerable to abuse and violence. The children of slaves could be sold or separated from their parents. Slaves had no control over their personal lives or relationships. Marriages between slaves were not legally recognized. Masters could arbitrarily end these unions, causing immense pain. Despite this, slaves formed deep emotional bonds and families. The strength of these bonds provided comfort and support. Some masters showed a degree of kindness and humanity. These instances, however, were exceptions rather than the norm. The power dynamics between masters and slaves were inherently exploitative. Even well-treated slaves lived under constant surveillance and control. Masters could reward loyalty with privileges or manumission. However, these rewards were rare and often came with strings attached. The threat of losing favor or privileges kept slaves in a state of anxiety. Some masters used psychological manipulation to maintain control. They played slaves against each other, fostering distrust and competition. This divide-and-conquer strategy kept slaves from uniting against their masters. Slaves had to navigate a treacherous social landscape to survive. Trust was a scarce commodity, both among slaves and with their masters. Betrayal was a constant risk, with severe consequences. Some slaves became informants, spying on their fellow slaves for their masters. This further eroded trust and solidarity within the slave community. The emotional toll of living under such conditions was immense. Despite this, slaves found ways to maintain their humanity and dignity. Chapter 4. Shadows of Rebellion. The constant oppression bred a spirit of rebellion among some slaves. Slave revolts, though rare, were significant and brutal. The most famous of these was the Spartacus Rebellion. Spartacus, a gladiator, led a massive slave uprising in 7371 BCE. The revolt began with a small group of gladiators escaping their training school. It quickly grew into a large-scale rebellion, attracting thousands of slaves. The rebels fought numerous battles against Roman forces. Spartacus proved to be a formidable leader and tactician. Despite their initial successes, the rebels faced overwhelming odds. The Roman army eventually crushed the rebellion. Spartacus and many of his followers were killed in battle. Surviving rebels faced brutal reprisals, including crucifixion. The rebellion had a lasting impact on Roman society. It highlighted the pervasive fear of slave uprisings among the elite. The rebellion also inspired hope and resistance among other slaves. Small acts of defiance and sabotage were common in everyday life. Slaves used subtle means to resist their master's control. Breaking tools, working slowly, and feigning illness were common tactics. These acts of resistance were dangerous, but provided a sense of agency. The fear of punishment, however, kept many slaves from overt rebellion. Roman authorities implemented harsh measures to prevent future uprisings. Increased surveillance and harsher punishments were common responses. The legacy of these rebellions influenced later slave societies. The struggle for freedom and justice continued long after Rome's fall. The memory of Spartacus and his rebellion became a symbol of resistance. Modern movements have drawn inspiration from these historical struggles. The fight against oppression and for human rights remains ongoing. The resilience and courage of these rebels continue to inspire today. The history of slave resistance is a testament to the indomitable human spirit. Their stories remind us of the importance of standing against injustice. Chapter 5: Legacy of Suffering. The legacy of Roman slavery continues to shape our understanding of history. It serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and exploitation. The scale and brutality of Roman slavery are staggering. Millions of people were subjected to unimaginable suffering and dehumanization. The economic and social structures of Rome were built on the backs of slaves. The wealth and power of the elite were directly tied to slave labor. The remnants of Roman slavery can be seen in modern systems of oppression. The fight for human rights and dignity is ongoing and deeply rooted in history. The stories of Roman slaves provide valuable lessons for today. They highlight the importance of empathy, justice, and resistance. Understanding this history helps us recognize and combat modern injustices. The resilience and strength of the enslaved are a source of inspiration. Their stories remind us of the enduring human spirit in the face of adversity. The legacy of suffering calls for reflection and action in our own lives. We must learn from history to create a more just and humane world. The fight against slavery and oppression is far from over. Modern slavery, human trafficking, and exploitation persist globally. Awareness and action are crucial in combating these issues. The stories of Roman slaves can galvanize efforts to fight contemporary injustices. Education and advocacy are key in this ongoing struggle. The lessons of history should inform our efforts to create a better future. We must honor the memory of those who suffered by striving for justice. The fight for human rights is a collective responsibility. We must stand against oppression in all its forms. The legacy of Roman slavery is a call to action for all of us. Our efforts can make a difference in the lives of those still oppressed. The resilience and courage of the enslaved are a beacon of hope. Their stories inspire us to continue the fight for justice. The history of Roman slavery is a powerful reminder of the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. Let us honor their legacy by working towards a world where freedom and dignity are universal rights. What do you think about the resilience and strength of Roman slaves? How can we apply their lessons to today's fight for human rights? Leave your comments below.